Hey everyone, Wes Dove here with Dove Development Consulting. I've got an opportunity to do something a little bit unique today. A lot of times in this Leading at the Next Level podcast, it's a lesson that Cindy and I have taught, and we've been able to do segments of those lessons for you, but we've been doing more and more live interviews, and I'm getting to do that as we share it initially live. It's going to go to our YouTube and our LinkedIn and our Facebook channels, but we're also having it in the podcast platform as we're able to do some editing. But we've got an opportunity today. I get to talk with Daniel Jones. He's a professor at the University of Nevada, Reno, and he'll talk more about that. But we've got an opportunity to talk about some really cool stuff. Before I do that, I want to make sure you know that this Leading at the Next Level podcast was really designed as a show built to provide you ongoing support for your leadership journey, wherever you're at. How can we tool you up with riding down the road, accessing from a PC, whatever it is? How can we make sure that your leadership journey is more effective and you're able to make a lasting impact on the people that you serve? That's what leadership is all about. So before Dan and I really dive into some of the awesome work that he's done around the toxic traits in the workplace and what he's branded as the dark triad, I want him to share a little bit about himself, because he and I've gotten to chat a little bit before today, but also in kind of a prep session for this, and just fascinating background. So Dan, go ahead and share a little bit about you, maybe some personal, professional. Give us something so the audience can connect and know who Dan is.
Thank you, Wes. So my name is Daniel Jones. I got my Ph.D. in personality and social psychology from the University of British Columbia back in 2011. And that was actually my mentor, Del Paulus, who coined the term the dark triad. I just hopped on board of that. And I've been studying this type of stuff for about 2 decades. And unlike a lot of people who get into research as me search, this was actually one of the topics that I just found raw curiosity driving me. So it wasn't any kind of like personal trauma or anything. But what was interesting about my journey through this is as I continued down this line of research and I started to learn more about these manipulative types, there were things in my past that I realized associated with them that were very dormant. And I was like, that was manipulation. I was led astray. And so that manipulation and coercion and things that the things that I dealt with that had filled me with doubt and fear were eventually replaced with clarity and peace as I began to realize this was not me. This was a manipulative process that had fallen upon me. So, you know, I want to start also by saying that everybody's been manipulated. This is not something that is unique to me or unique to you if you're listening. These people are out there, and while it's a fraction of the population, they account for a good chunk of the harm.
And just for the connectivity, I love hearing that background. I love hearing how you got there. I heard you mention British Columbia. Before we came on, we were talking a little bit about the guitars. For the folks seeing this on a video recording somewhere, you see guitars over each of my shoulders. You mentioned somebody in Maryland, I think you said, that was your guitar teacher. Where have you lived? You're in Reno right now, but where else have you been? What's some of your history?
So I grew up in northern New Jersey. I did school in southern New Jersey. Then I did a year at the National Institute of Drug Abuse in Baltimore, Maryland as a pre-doctoral. Then I moved to the University of Arizona to do a experimental social psychology program. I actually did not work out there, so I left that PhD program, took a year, lived in Costa Rica to do travel and cross-cultural research, try to get my feet back into a PhD program. Once you've been, kind of left the PhD program, it is really hard to get back in. A lot of people have questions, rightfully so. I had a lot of support from 2 professors in particular at University of Arizona who never stopped believing in me. AJ Figueredo and Jake Jacobs actually are their names. They're really great guys. And Del Paulus at University of British Columbia took a shot on me. And so I wound up moving to Vancouver. And then, of course, I did a visiting professor position at Lincoln, Nebraska, found my way to El Paso, Texas for legal psychology. And then I found my way to Reno, Nevada for management. So it's been a long journey.
Outstanding. And I know you've got some dogs, and you don't have to share all the stuff about the dogs that we connected on that. So, and I'll be transparent, guys. If by any chance you all hear dogs in the background, those are mine. I'll take full responsibility. My wife and I've got 2 rescues, and there's just no control in them. Praise God, they're good dogs, but sometimes they're dumber than stumps. So anyway, on that too, right?
So I do have 2 dogs, but I am actually new to the dog ownership. My pet for 11 years was a rabbit. I had a pet bunny that almost broke the world record for a lifetime. And I think it was all the Lucky Charms and the cereals I fed him. Like Pop-Tarts, Lucky Charms were kind of his staple. He was as smart as a tack bunny. And yeah, lived with me 11 years, died when I moved to El Paso. But he lived in Jersey, Baltimore, Vancouver, Tucson, El Paso, Lincoln, Nebraska. So he was a well-traveled rabbit and had a very happy life. But yeah, my two new dogs are my thing now. So
that's awesome. So before we get serious, I've got to ask one question. So I'm an 80s hair band, just nut, right? I love it. You've mentioned Baltimore a couple times. Are you familiar with the band Kicks? They retired last year. They're an 80s band, so it might be a little bit before your time.
It was a little bit before. I mean, when I was growing up in the 80s, all I listened to was Phil Collins and Billy Joel. I was pretty tame. I didn't get into the hair or heavy metal or some of the really cool stuff until I was much, much older. So I'm sorry. But,
yeah, so I'll put my series hat back on. But yeah, the Baltimore, I couldn't take the pressure. And my wife is, if she's watching this right now, she just rolled her eyes like, dear God. Whatever. So gosh, in our initial conversation, Dan, you shared something that you've seen folks assume about that toxic behavior in high-level executives, but also in the really high-skilled employees. And you've also often seen it then emulated in those people where they've like, hey, we've seen this person do it. They're really respected for their skill set, and we've seen them be toxic, blah, blah, blah. And then you mentioned that there was no statistical correlation to toxic behavior and high skill. Share a little bit about that here, and I think that can give a pretty solid foundation for us for the rest of the conversation.
Yeah. So, and I can't speak to other cultures, but I can say in the United States, we have kind of a morbid fascination with highly skilled and rogue leaders. I love the show House, the medical show that was on for many, and people see those examples, right? Of somebody who's incredibly beyond the pale intelligent and aptitude, but kind of an ass, right? And so we have these high profile cases. Steve Jobs is the CEO that comes to mind, was very toxic in his early days, but very visionary. And we tend to think when two unusual things go together, like being extraordinarily visionary and being abusive, but neither of those are common. They're very rare. When those two things go together, it forms what we call in psychology an illusory correlation. So illusory correlations are where two unusual things go together. And because of the unusual nature of both of those events occurring at the same time, we tend to think there's an association when there's not. And so the research was originally done on things like stereotyping and racism, where if you have somebody that's a member of a minoritized group or an unrepresented group, and they do something that's unusual, we tend to think that is associated with that group. I argue that this same thing is going on here with abusive supervision, visionary supervision. We look at exemplars like Steve Jobs, and because we assume they're associated, and humans tend to confuse correlation with causation, we then think if we act abusive, people will see us as competent, and that there is absolutely no association between those two things. And as we know, abusive and toxic behavior definitely detracts from any kind of visionary skill you would have.
Yeah, and it was funny when Kim, I think your cousin, actually reached out to me about this conversation with us. When she reached out, she mentioned some of your background. My initial response was, well, I don't deal with toxic behavior, so I'm not sure there's much to talk about. Right. And because at this stage in our life, Cindy and I focus so much on how do we develop leaders, not managers and supervisors. I don't give a shit what somebody's title is. I do care about how they serve people.
Right.
But I was an HR and safety manager for a long time. I was in that field, and I did have to deal with it. And I mean, there are a couple folks that I still help with some onboarding and some hiring today because that was my background, right? And the ones that I'm willing to work with are the ones that say, hey, if they don't match our culture, if they don't match our values, I don't care what their skill is. And so many times, Dan, the companies aren't willing to. I just had a conversation earlier today where it was the hiring manager needs the skill so bad they're willing to take anything, and that wrecks an environment, right?
Right. Well, and so I have a friend at New Mexico State University named Becky Perez who did her dissertation on companies being drawn to more narcissistic types when they're failing, when they're swirling the drain, the desperation that comes with, and it's human nature that if you are going down a very, very counterproductive road, things are dire. Who are you going to take as your next leader? You're going to take somebody that's going to be like, oh, well, you're in a bad situation. I don't know what's going to happen. Or the guy that's going to, I'm Superman and I'm going to save you any means necessary, right? But the problem with that, Wes, is as you perceive this talent, this skill, you make a Faustian bargain, right? If the person is toxic. And so, unfortunately, perceived talent is the Trojan horse that sneaks abuse into an organization.
Yeah, and so many of the owners that we interact with, so many of the folks that I've done any coaching relationships with where they've got an issue, I've said, hey, we've got to separate the two things. It's not about I like or I dislike the person. We've got to address the behavior. I can, in fact, say, hey, I love you, but your behavior has violated the policy X number of times. And if I've went through the first and the second and the third step in the disciplinary process, it might be a conversation to where I say, I love you, but you don't get to work here anymore.
Right. And I think people have to understand in these tough situations that visionary leadership, abusive leadership, while they are unrelated, can be packaged in the same individual. And unfortunately, you now have to make a collective decision about the whole package. You don't get to disembody the person's talent from their behavior. And the vision of one could mean the toxicity of 100. Are you really willing to take that trade-off? Right. Oh. And I think that's where that needs to be addressed directly through HR channels, through proper channels. And those people need to be removed regardless of the vision. And I was having a conversation with somebody recently about that. And we were talking about, well, the visionary leadership now belongs to somebody else and we're going to miss that. Yes, but so does the toxicity. And so you have to understand that what could be a move forward in vision, strategy, talent, productivity could be 3 steps backward in terms of culture, health, and mental health of your workers. Yeah.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
I know I've written on it. I don't remember if it was in What's Killing Your Profitability, or it was down to leadership, or it was some other lesson I did. But I give an example. I've seen a couple different places where highly skilled, highly effective folks in the roles were in the supervisory or manager role. But the folks, they had a revolving door in the chain underneath them. And the new folks, there was never any hope of getting somebody up to speed, because by the time they were getting somewhat skilled, gosh, the toxicity drove them away. And the argument I always make is, which do you need? This person someday is probably going to leave or die, one or the other.
Right.
We've got nobody because they're running everybody else off.
Right. And so there are several examples through the course of my conversations with leaders and workers that I can think of, where the individual is locked into the position and the employees are in a revolving door. And what upper management generally fails to see is that, the turnover is costly at all forms, right? You should not have that culture and not have that continuity in workers, especially in an industry where turnover is unexpected, right? I mean, restaurants, bars, you expect a certain level of turnover as kids, college kids, for example, that work there, move on, graduate, things like that. It's not so damaging as an organization where turnover really is damaging, right? And so you have this toxic leadership and people are moving away, taking their skills elsewhere. But what ends up happening, Wes, is a lot of times the toxic leaders or supervisors or whatever, they've already prepped or groomed the upper management. And that's often why they're not removed. So in a conversation I had with a consultant many years ago in Brazil, he was telling me that he worked with an organization. He was trying to tell them, look, you have this person that needs to be removed. And they said, yeah, no, we think the workers are just being sensitive, right? Because he went to the top management initially and inoculated them to the complaints they were going to. He said, look, I'm going to do my job. I'm going to make the trains run on time. I may have to crack some skulls to do it. And because he was in with the upper management, top management team, they refused to remove him because they perceived these complaints that started to come in as evidence of him doing his job. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And
unfortunately makes sense, I should say.
It 100% makes sense. And unfortunately, I mean, you're right. I mean, that's a piece that I hammer all the time. The cost of turnover is huge. I mean, all the stats I see are anywhere from half of someone's annual salary, and that's usually an entry level position, to as much as 5 times. And that executive, that higher level manager, it can cost 5 times their annual salary to replace them, get the new person spun up, all the different things. And so often, the executives, the bean counters, if you will. Sorry for any bean counters out there.
Yeah.
They're not seeing the indirect costs. They're only looking at, here's what the ad cost, here's what the sign-on bonus costs, and so on. And they're missing some of the things that aren't. I'm not going to use the word intangible. I'm going to say they're harder to make them tangible.
That's right. I'd like to add, actually, I was a bartender for many years, and I started bartending in Tucson, Arizona. And there was a bar that I signed on for. I was very excited to get the job. And the owner of the bar was a very bad leader and not a nice guy. So he had a reputation for putting the hammer down on his bartenders. The women bartenders had to hug him before their shifts. It was a really creepy situation. And he set up a situation behind the bar where he had me taking the beer orders, but other bartenders would take the drink orders, which made no sense because you'd have somebody waiting in line, 10 people come up, and I'll say, well, I can get your beer, but you got to go get back in line to get your Long Island iced tea. Made no sense. So at the end of the night, I went up and I said, look, this situation created awkwardness. I explained I was fired the next day. I said, get new bartenders. And his bar went under. But that's an example of even an industry where it's designed to accommodate for turnover. High turnover, you're going to drive your business underground, right? Into the ground, I should say.
Yeah. And those, interestingly enough, those are 2 chapters that I wrote about in my last book. And I'm going to at some point write a book about there's no profit if we don't have people. Now,
That's right.
With this conversation, one of the things after you and I initially spoke and set this up, I saw you share something on LinkedIn that showed, it was called the narcissistic abuse cycle. Mm-hmm. And if you're willing, kind of talk about that a little bit, share how you've seen it impact work environment when that person in the leadership role, and Dan, I absolutely refuse to call that person a leader because, right, hey, sitting in the car, the garage don't make me a car. Right? Being in the role don't make them a leader. When they're exhibiting that behavior that was detailed in that cycle.
Mm-hmm. Well, in order to answer where that came from, I have to give a little background on the study of these personalities, the dark triad, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, narcissism. When I first started studying them, I went back and I actually read Niccolo Machiavelli. I actually read Sun Tzu and the Art of War, because I wanted to try to get into the headspace of Christie and Geist and where they were coming from in developing this construct. And one of the things that Machiavelli harped on in his book was, you give the masses enough that they don't revolt. Give the masses, give the people what they need to keep them just satisfied, right? Because revolution is the most dangerous thing besides the second in command, is one of the most dangerous things to a leader's power. And I think in a one-on-one relationship, that same analogy holds for how some of these folks think about this. They're going to give you the charm. They're going to give you the honeymoon periods. They're going to give you the love in a romantic relationship, just enough so that you tolerate the abuse. And then you start to question your own judgment, your decisions, and what caused that abuse, right? Because they were so sweet got so thoughtful. So is it me, right? Because if it was abuse all the time, nobody would put up with it. So now extrapolating back to the business world, right? If you have a leader who is, let's say, face traces of narcissism, right? They may lavishly praise, compliment, do something in front of you. It's like, damn, wow, he really put me up on a pedestal there. But make no mistake, if the person fits this pattern and you become a liability, you become a problem, you become something that embarrassed them, they have no hesitation to throw you under the bus because you are pawns in their ultimate game of number one being important. So ultimately, what you end up doing is dealing with this back and forth whiplash in a relationship, especially with a narcissistic individual, where your abuse is punctuated with these moments of praise, compliments, charm. And it's a cycle because it keeps you there, but it also allows them to do the things they feel like they have to do to maintain their power and control. So moving on beyond abuse, manipulation functions in the same thing. Nobody announces their manipulative intention. Okay, Wes, I'm going to manipulate you for the next half an hour. No, manipulators don't do, at least if they have any skill, they don't do that, right? But the thing that's funny about manipulation and the way it's been studied is it's been done all wrong. People will ask, which of these manipulative tactics have you used, or which of these things have you said to a partner? But we don't do it all at once. We do it in sequence, right? So, people high in psychopathy or who lack that impulse control and tend to lie more frequently and copiously, they're going to beeline it to the gaslighting and the coercion. But individuals like narcissistic and Machiavellian individuals, they may not gaslight you at first when you get into a discussion with them. A manipulative leader may start with a conversation like any honest, empathetic person would. Let's do this the rational way first. But if that fails, they will dig into their bag of tricks and the knives come out. So we have to be aware that this whiplash occurs in organizations when leaders will want to pull you in, get you to do things like, hey, buddy, let's do this. But make no mistake about it. When somebody, as Maya Angelou once said, when somebody reveals who they are the first time, believe them. So when that abuse comes back, you have to understand that this is not your fault and you need to get away because you're dealing with somebody who has one of these characteristics or traits. Yeah.
100%. Wow. So you just described at least two folks that I've worked with. One was my direct supervisor of the construction crew I worked for when I was 19 years old. And I watched that nice until he wasn't. And it was a little bit and then back off and then it was less. And at 19 years old, I remember watching the weakest link he would always single out. And over time it was push it out. And then who's the new weakest link?
Right.
And now, Dan, I'm just as we were having this conversation, I just finished up the manuscript for a new book that's really about why it's so important for anybody in a leadership role to have a clear purpose that gets them out of bed, because quite frankly, some days leading a team, taking responsibility sucks. It'd be easier to just say, give me a stupid job that I can make the widgets. Remember the time to make the donuts commercial from Dunkin'?
I do.
Easier, right?
Yeah.
I'm saying all that to say, tell me why you do what you do. Tell me more about what drove you, what the darktriad.co, some of the different things, what really brought you down this path, and what impact do you want to have through the work that you're doing?
So for the longest time, like I said, it was raw curiosity and interest that drove my initial on-ramp. Once I got on the highway, it was actually the University of Nevada Reno students that gave me purpose. I would lecture, and I still do. Every semester, I dedicate one class to the dark triad. And I'm just basically, this is my area of interest. Suck it up, guys. I'm going to give you a class on it because this is what I love to talk about. And every semester, I'd have a student come up to me, and I have this narcissistic boss. I have this Machiavellian, psychopathic, what I suspect to be, who I suspect to be, that type of person. What do I do? And for the longest time, my answers were pathetic. Well, avoid them. Deal with them over email. Quit. Go to HR. Have a conversation with them. And every single time, more often than not, the students said, tried all that. You got anything else? No, I'm out. That was unacceptable to me. And I finally realized these students are a microcosm of the larger workforce. And we need to come up with some solutions, actionable solutions, tangible advice where people can actually manage the situation until they can get away. Because nothing I'm going to do, nothing I'm going to say, nothing I can teach you is going to teach you how to deal with these people in perpetuity, because they are not going to change. There is a permanence to a lack of empathy and a lack of honesty. They are thinking one step ahead of you constantly. They are always planning. You are always going to play catch up with their manipulation. So no matter how good you are, if you are an honest, empathetic person, you do eventually acclimate to the company you keep. Get away. That is, I cannot emphasize that enough. But if you are stuck and there is no place to go for the time being, you've got to feed your family, you've got to get a salary, you can't leave this location, you have a sick relative, then what I tell people, and through the TEDx talk that I gave, is there are 3 basic strategies that you can use to get through it, which is stay cold, keep emotionally distant. Don't let that whiplash, that yo-yo effect of the charm pull you in. The person, you have to focus now on the externalities. I'm here for my family, which leads to the next one, which is bottom line. Why are you there? It's to support your family. Remind yourself of that. Put pictures of your family. Remind, this is for my daughter. This is for my, stay on that external focus. And then rational. You're not going to win in a battle of public appearance. They have already crossed those T's and dotted those I's. You are not going to get them to fall to their knees and say, you're right. Oh my God, I've been an asshole my whole life. I see the light. Now, that is not going to happen. That has never happened in the history of narcissism. Okay. What can you get out of the situation now? You got to be brass tacks. If I do this, I will get that. These are the external reasons. I'm going to proceed with that knowledge. Okay. So I call it if you use, like CPR to help people breathe, then CBR, cold bottom line rational, is helping people breathe in these situations. But at the end of the day, it's a stopgap, Wes. There's no way you're going to fix the situation. You got to get out when you finally can. And so that inspired me. I couldn't deal looking in their eyes and saying, yeah, we've studied this stuff for more than 20 some odd years, and I have nothing for you on how to protect yourself from them. That's unacceptable to me. So I almost got mad. And so 20 years, we've known how they hurt, why they hurt, who they hurt, nothing on how to help them. So that's why what really has reinvigorated my research stream and got my passion going now.
Dan, I couldn't be more taken back by the response. I just love that, because the second part of the manuscript for the Leading with Purpose book that I've got is really about how a leader needs to make sure they understand their individual team member's purpose and help that team member connect what they've got to do on a given day back to what drives them as an individual. And that's and that's just so important. You weren't talking to folks that reported to you. You were talking to folks, that students in your case, but the folks coming to say, how do I fix this? And that's what leadership's all about. That's stellar. And that's the impact. Think of the ripple effect that you've got when you give those tools to somebody, the CBR, and I put those in the comments, the CBR instead of CPR. When you help somebody connect the dots, hey, I've got to go through this suck right now. Right. But here's why I'm doing it. And here's how here's what I'm looking for.
That's right. And I want to caution. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. How does that make you feel about, here's the impact I can have if somebody listens to me, how it can change their life?
I mean, that's where I derived my passion. There was my dean was just talking at a college meeting the other day about a book he read it's called The Meaning of Life. And to give you the Cliff Notes version of it, it's other people, right? What are we leaving? What impact are we having on people when we leave this earth? What mark have we made in the minds of our comrades? And I think that makes a lot of sense. And so for me, moving aimlessly paper to paper as an academic wears on you after a while. Okay, the 200th paper, am I going to derive meaning from that? And so on, right? The 200th paper that 3 people are going to read at some point. What is the point of this journey? And I feel like those people who have reached out and said, I need help, have given me now a purpose beyond just tenure, full professor, and grants, and a cycle of research that felt to me very diffuse and very obtuse in my sense of purpose. And now I feel reinvigorated through that. And so, yeah, I think those UNR students, I owe a great deal of gratitude. I have a great deal of gratitude to them for alerting me to the fact that this needs to be done. So yeah, and to the other part of leading with purpose and finding meaning in other people. I mean, at the end of the day, if I help one person with this, mission accomplished. But I also want to caution that I don't want this to become a never-ending arms race of manipulation, right? The CBR stuff I talk about never should be used in healthy relationships, never should be used with empathetic, kind people. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say the majority of issues you're facing at work, anybody listening to this, exhaust the legitimate channels first. Yeah. Don't beeline it to CBR. Go talk to the person, talk to HR, get communication errors, misunderstandings. That is the vast majority of workplace toxicity. Yeah. Deal with it, get on the right page, get on the same page, lead up. There's a great TEDx talk by Leif Babin, talks about lead up. with your leaders. Do all those things. Make an effort. Don't just assume the person's a narcissist. We see narcissists in our sleep these days. We have to stop doing that. There are people who are good-hearted people that make mistakes. Learn to forgive, learn to move on. Okay. But if you are dealing with somebody like this and you can't get away, then it's a time to deploy the tactics. But I don't want to see people manipulating each other all over the place. That was never my purpose.
Funny you say that, Dan. Several years ago, Cindy and I are leading a group through some communication tools, and one of the participants kept asking me through the process, well, what would keep someone from using this to manipulate others? And finally, I just got pissed off. And I said, the only way I know to not be manipulative is don't freaking be manipulative.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because if you read 48 Laws to Power, right, it has a very cynical flavor to it. And, I heard through several channels that the author never intended it really to be this weapon. It was really a defense. It was really how to handle these tough situations. And I can't agree more. At the end of the day, you have to answer to yourself, higher power, if you believe in a higher power, stuff like that. What's stopping somebody from commandeering these tactics and becoming a better Machiavellian? I suppose nothing. And that's the risk I'm willing to take, because I want to ask somebody who challenges me on that front. And it's a legitimate challenge, but I want to ask, what's the ethics of saying nothing and letting people suffer, right? I balanced that trade-off before I presented the TEDx talk. I balanced that before I've advocated for these tactics. There are some people who are legitimately going to say, oh, all right, arms race. Now I'm a Machiavellian. Now I'm going to become a better Machiavellian with this advice and things like that. I'm willing to accept that trade-off for somebody out there suffering with an abusive leader who can actually not deteriorate mentally, not take it out on their family, not suffer, and be able to defend themselves in some kind of way.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, there's always going to be some form of evil in the world. And I mean, that the only way it succeeds is when good men do nothing, right? So
exactly. That's right. So, at the end of the day, and I can't emphasize this part enough, Wes, I want to build off what you just said because it's super important. You can't change them. Let it go. Move on. Because there are some people who, to their core, don't have humanity. And at that point, you have to switch into survival mode, take care of what you can with the cards you've been dealt. But going after them, and I've never been an advocate of revenge. Actually, there's a great scholar from Virginia Commonwealth named Everett Worthington, who has done a tremendous amount of research on forgiveness. And he advocates, at the end of the day, this revenge, tit for tat, it goes nowhere. So yes, if you can forgive, move on, but get away, you're not going to change them.
Well, so Dan, just before we started this conversation, I had a coaching session with one of my lifelong friends. He's owned several successful businesses and so on, and he had made a social media post recently saying, "Hey, just because you're family doesn't mean I'm going to let your toxicity be in my life."
Right. That's right.
And we're talking business primarily, but the same thing goes with family too. Hey, we've got to be good people, and sometimes we just can't own that and control it.
I completely agree with you. Family becomes a very tricky situation where you are blood, you are bound, but that doesn't mean you have to be vulnerable. That doesn't mean you have to be bowled over and destroyed. Yep. So, they talk about that there is a lot of people will advocate for setting boundaries and setting, narcissists see boundaries as challenges. They see them as opportunities and a gauntlet that's been thrown down, not a boundary as good empathetic people would see it. And so with family, it becomes incredibly tricky, but you ultimately are responsible for your life. You do what you can to maintain the cohesion of the family. But at some point, you have to make a choice, because if the toxicity is going to take over, what kind of life do you want to lead? Right?
Yep.
And it's your life.
Yeah, I mean, I remember telling I'm going to say a toxic employee once to say, hey, when there's cancer in a body, the surgeon cuts out the cancer.
Yeah.
If you're choosing to be that cancer in the organization, I'm going to be the surgeon.
Yeah. Well, and I think there are ways of handling different types of toxic personalities. Some, depending on the severity and depending on the other types of situations they find themselves in. So we just recently published a paper. It hasn't come out yet, so you'll get a sneak preview that's not even on the internet yet, where we found that all humans, and this was researched by the famous Albert Bandura on what's called moral disengagement. And he finds that there are 6 or 7 kind of higher level tactics people use to feel good about themselves, even though they're doing something pretty crummy. So things like advantageous comparison, right? Well, yeah, I mean, so I do whatever. It's not like I'm smoking crack, right? Or I stole a couple $1,000s. I'm no Bernie Madoff, though, right? Stuff like that. And it ultimately leads them to disengage their sense of self-sanction so they can do immoral things and still feel like a moral person, right? And so what we did was we dug into the 1960s literature on psychological inoculation. And what we did was we inoculated people to those rationalizations, those higher order rationalizations. And what we found was it had no main impact, but it impacted those high in narcissism the most. If you inoculate narcissistic people to these disengagements, they actually act ethically. Because at the end of the day, a narcissist still has a superior identity and needs to feel good. They just have a hair trigger for entitlement and rationalization with their deceptive acts. If you take those tools away, they struggle to be unethical. Now, it had no impact on those high in Machiavellianism and narcissism. But I bring that up because individuals high in Machiavellianism, often if you put very strong guardrails around the situation and you make the symmetries such that this crime, this action, this antisocial behavior is just not worth it, your expedient path is the honest one, you're going to find Machiavellian individuals will generally, not always, but generally adhere to that path because it is the most expedient path to success. So making sanctions, again, with these workers, these employees, these toxic, abusive, exploitative bosses, make it not worth their time. If they're high in Machiavellianism, you will curtail a lot of that behavior. Now, the one that all bets are off for is psychopathy. I still have no solution for that, but can't win them all.
Yep. Now, this is fascinating. You've in digging through your website, and again, that's in the comments. I don't know if it's posted to the LinkedIn side, but it's in the Facebook and YouTube streams, and I'll get it later. darktriad.co. Mm-hmm. On that website, you've got a few different assessments, and my perspective is these are assessments you and your peers have created, maybe you specifically. Walk me through the one that's titled, "Do you know a toxic person at work or in your life?"
Yeah. So it was incredibly tricky. And as a work on these assessments, in order to finally arrive at something that I'm ready to put complete faith behind, it's going to be a few more permutations. But here's the thing. These people are not, you don't know why somebody's being toxic. You just know the behavior, right? So what we tried to do in developing these assessments was isolate behaviors that were observable and that wouldn't really be committed by somebody who didn't have this callous and manipulative streak in them, right? So one of the items is laughs at somebody in pain, right? Now, I don't know if you've ever done that, Wes. Somebody's genuinely in pain and you laugh at them, but I would suspect no, because that's pretty callous thing to do. Lie on an observable contract, right? That's a pretty brazen thing to do. So you're not going to see that too often from somebody who just was pushed, through circumstance. That's going to be something that only somebody like that is committed. Now, again, I encourage people to take the assessment. It is pretty accurate. We are still validating some of these questions, but ultimately what it comes down to is, has this person displayed callousness and manipulation, and in what form? And Machiavellianism is the hardest one to assess because they live their lives shrouded in secrecy. So how can you ultimately observe Machiavellian behavior from somebody who is constantly trying to obfuscate the purpose and the reason behind what they're doing? It is incredibly tricky. So one of the things we've taken to also is asking some questions about oral contracts, oral agreements, things that can't be proven, and then looking for contradictions, right? I was a consultant on a case once where they said this guy was a charlatan, but they had no paper trail. Constantly, the guy was always making backdoor deals, constantly leveraging personal, romantic, social, professional connections to leverage startups and, investments and funding. And that's Machiavellian behavior, right? There's no paper trail. It's very hard to convict people. And now as things have gravitated towards cybersecurity, AI, online behavior, it's so incredibly difficult to prosecute, find, let alone trace any of this type of behavior. So a lot of them have found a safe haven with cyber crime. And that's why I'm drawn a lot to the cybersecurity research. So at the end of the day, yeah, you've got, Machiavellian behavior, but it's incredibly difficult to track. So that's why I say this assessment, getting back to the point, that you can take, and it's accurate. I promise people it'll give you a ballpark of where they're at. It's not the final version. It's a work in progress. It's a first stab at trying to do this in a meaningful way.
Yeah. And it's something that's a no-cost resource that you've got out there right now. It's part of the research you're doing, right? So it's a really cool tool for somebody, if you're dealing with this, to go to the darktriad.co and work through it. Dan, I noticed your email's on there, so you've even got the touch point to say, hey, how can I walk you through this and isolate the situation? It's pretty cool that you're willing to do that.
And I want to say also, anybody from, a major corporate leader to somebody dealing with a domestic violence situation to somebody dealing with just a narcissistic brother or sister, reach out to me. I'm not a therapist. I don't diagnose. I don't do therapy, but I can give tools to at least elucidate or illuminate the situation, give you some clarity as to what's going on. And I am open to conversations. Please reach out.
Yeah. And one of the things that you said earlier, and it just brings me to, so for about 15 years or so, I traveled North America training on this thing called behavior-based safety. Mm-hmm. And what I learned, and we talked about so much through that, is I can't see your attitude or your emotion, but I can indeed see your behavior. And through your behavior, I can learn to understand your attitudes and your emotions.
Precisely.
And I loved what you said about these specific behaviors are ones that are only likely to come from folks with these specific emotions.
That was how the assessment was designed initially. There are, again, like I said, future iterations coming out as we learn more. And again, if you have ever accidentally laughed at somebody in pain, or maybe you fudged a signature on something once because it was trivial, that doesn't mean you're a raging psychopath. Okay, please understand it's an accumulation of these behaviors over time that create red flags. But ultimately, one of the things that frustrates me about organizations, and I think we need to do a better job of this, is helping each other out. I just gave a talk to the Nuclear Energy Institute on their preparation for duty and fitness for duty. And one of the things that people would say is when they call for a reference and the person was toxic, very often they'll say, well, we can't discuss it. It's an internal matter. It's confidential. Because they don't want to give a bad referral because they want their dumpster fire walking away. But they don't want to impugn their integrity to the point where they lie and say, oh, he's great, take him. So they end up in this messy middle where they don't want to talk about it. And I really want to break this culture of silence across organizations. When somebody is toxic and we need to get rid of them, let's also be honest about these things. Because, at the most egregious forms, you have predators, right? People who are teachers, scoutmasters, who are abusing children or doing really horrible things, and they move on to another district. Problem was not solved. Yeah. Your problem was solved, but you've just dumped that problem onto new vulnerable kids. And that's that. And you alluded earlier to, in times of crisis, people who do nothing. Yeah, that's exactly what you're doing. Yeah. So let's create a culture where people can't just take their unethical behavior somewhere else, where they're actually held accountable for it.
Well, here's the HR nerd that comes out in me a little bit. Unfortunately, in our litigious society, most of the rules are written in a way through employment law to say that as an HR professional, I can't give you good or bad because I'm on the hook. If I give you good feedback and the person turns out to be a train wreck, I'm liable. If I give you good or bad feedback and it keeps you from hiring them, I'm liable. So it's almost, and in many corporate environments, and quite frankly, I've counseled many of our clients to say, hey, and your best case scenario is to say, here's their dates of employment because of the laws around it. And to the point, and where I'm going with that, Dan, is it really puts us to where we're forced, because of the threat of legal action on either side, to allow bad behavior to permeate.
So let me clarify, and I'm glad you brought that up, Wes. I am not blaming the HR professionals covering their ass. I am not. I think this has to be a grassroots movement from the very, very bottom up or top down, whatever you want to call it, with respect to law, with respect to the way we conduct our society. This has to become the norm now. Whether laws need to change, whether corporate cultures need to change, I don't care. But you cannot have abusive people moving around without recourse. It just isn't right. We do have a paper that we looked at. We scraped FINRA data from financial investors. We haven't published it yet, but and we find that people who move around a lot tend to have two traits. They're either unethical or they're ambitious. Now, how can you tell the difference between somebody who's moving around from ambition? And we have preliminary data suggesting if they've never stayed in one place ever for very long, that's the red flag. They can't stay in one place for very long. Now, somebody like I was at UTEP for 6 years. I've been at UNR for 6 years. I have established that I think I can be trusted, right? But if it was 8 months, a year at every place I've been, look at the red flags. And the other thing is we need to train HR professionals from onboarding companies to we can't talk about it translates into stay away.
Yep. Fantastic. And yeah, make no mistake, I'm not excusing it. I'm giving that
No,
perspective.
no, I understand. And again, I'm not trying to repudiate anybody who just is doing their job. I think this has to be a culture-wide, a society-wide movement where we don't let people off the hook because they moved and left their dumpster fire behind, because they're going to light a new one where they arrive.
Oh, and it's not if, it's when.
Yeah, it's when. It's not.
Yeah. So we could go through that 6 ways from Sundays. So Dan, we're beyond 45 minutes, and I'm okay with that. But is there anything that you would like to share just to kind of put a bow on it? If somebody's walking away from this, what's the one takeaway that they need to understand? And I would even ask if you're willing to put, like I say, I've got the dark triad in the comments, but if you're willing to put, if you want to do an email address, whatever that contact information is in the comments, you're welcome to do that as well. Because it's some cool resources you've put together, and I love that you're addressing it, as opposed to my initial response saying, well, shit, if they're toxic, I don't want to deal with it. Well, the reality is we have to.
We have to. And you're going to encounter one or more of these types of people at some point in your life. I always joke with people, if you've dated more than 3 or 4 people in your life, usually one of them was a narcissist. It's almost like a rite of passage. The one thing I would say more than anything else is take care of yourself, because this is not your fault. You find these people get their hooks into you and you kick yourself. You say, I should have known. What the hell was I thinking? What the hell were we thinking? We've all been there. So please, 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 if you take nothing away from this, understand that this is not your fault. If you can learn, if you can grow, if you can move, great, but move on from it. Get away from the person, especially if it's a romantic relationship. Get out. It's not going to change. It's never going to change. And it's the same thing with these company cultures. When these people reveal their hands, believe them and move to get rid of them. Because ultimately, it's the difference between getting rid of maybe somebody who's kind of sexy and visionary and punchy in their ideas versus the whole company going down. I am not being dramatic. I have seen it happen. So yeah, if nothing else, accept the situation for what it is, accept the decisions you've made, understand that this is not something that you should be self-flagellating over, but you do need to take very serious, pragmatic, and action-ready steps to move on.
Dan, this has been fantastic. I've enjoyed it. I'll give a quick closeout. I'll end the stream and so on. Hang with me, and we'll chat once the feed killed. Mm-hmm. So if you're accessing this, if you're on the podcast or wherever you're at and you're accessing this and you need continuing education credit, this, what Dan and I are doing, I didn't submit it in advance for HR, CI, or SHRM like we usually do, but much of our body of work is. And if you need those credits in the human resource, even though I've attacked you a little bit in the human resource send me an email at admin@dove-development.net, and I'll hook you up with a complimentary or a 45-day pass to one of our courses that has, I think about 150 lessons that are approved for credit in it right now. You can kick the tires, access it, get your credits, do whatever. And if it serves you, great. But with that said, Dan, thank you so much for the time. I hope this serves you well.
This has been a pleasure. Yeah. And again, the website is darktriad.co, and my email is either djones2@unr.edu or jonesdn@gmail.com. I check them both regularly.
And I'm putting the Jones D in because I captured that. It's in the comments
Yeah.
right now. So it's out there. And again, thank you for that time. Stick with
Thank you
me
for having me.
for a second. We'll kill the live stream and we'll chat as we wrap it up.